Good afternoon. Welcome to the Manetti Strum Museum. My name is Adrienne, and I'm a Visitor Services student staffer here. And before we begin today's program, we should take a moment to acknowledge the land on which UC Davis sits. For thousands of years, this land has been the home of the Patwin people. Today, there are 3 federally recognized Patwin tribes: Pechanga Band of Luisen Indians of the Calusa Indian Community, the Band of Luisen Indians of the Calusa Indian Community, Quetzaldihi Wintun Nation, and Yochadihi Wintun Nation. The Patwin people have remained committed to the stewardship of this land over many centuries. It has been cherished and protected as elders have instructed the young through generations. We are honored and grateful to be here today on their traditional lands. Thank you.
If everyone can please remember to silence their cell phones, we can get started. Hello, and welcome to the Art Studio Visiting Artist Lecture Series. My name is Nitin Ramalingam. I'm a second-year Art Studio graduate student. The Art Studio Visiting Artist Lecture Series is a critical component of the MFA curriculum. It provides graduate students with the opportunity to hear world-renowned artists, critics, and curators speak about their work and to conduct one-on-one studio visits with each speaker. We are grateful to Dean Atekwana and the College of Letters and Science for supporting this lecture series. Before I introduce today's speaker, I would like to thank the Jan and Maria Manetti Shrem Museum of Art for hosting this lecture, and the Art Studio faculty who work hard coordinating these programs. Today, I'm pleased to introduce Sky Hopinka. His video, photo, and text work centers around personal positions of Indigenous homeland and landscape, designs of language as containers of culture expressed through personal, documentary, and nonfiction forms of media. Sky Hopinka was born and raised in Ferndale, Washington, and is a member of the Ho-Chunk Nation and Pechanga Band of Luisen Indians. His films have been screened at the Sundance Film Festival, Punto de Vista, and the New York Film Festival. He has had solo exhibitions at the Center for Curatorial Studies, Bard College, and most recently, Luma in Arles, France. He is the recipient of fellowships from the Radcliffe Institute for Advanced Study at Harvard University, Art Matters, and the Guggenheim Foundation. In the fall of 2022, Hopinka received a MacArthur Fellowship for his work as a visual artist and filmmaker. We are honored to have him here with us today. Please join me in giving a warm welcome to Sky Hopinka.
Hello, it's really good to be here. I always like traveling through California. It always feels like home in a way. I was born in Northern Washington and I grew up in Ferndale, Washington, but also when I was 12 years old, my family moved to Southern California, to Palm Springs, and then eventually to Riverside. And I'd always pass through here when I was driving between Washington and California. I think it was like one of the first places that I really thought about the road, or the road as a space, and as a place, and as an idea, and as a container of all these different people and conduits and ideas and experiences. I don't know, I just wanted to, give thanks for that. And thank you for having me. Thank you to the grad students for the time that they spent with me this morning for the studio visits. and thank you all for being here. I wanted to start with this. This is a text that I wrote for a catalog called Perfidia, which I guess is a book of poems that accompanied my exhibition at CCS, at the Hessel Museum at Bard. This is a beginning that isn't a beginning. This is the youth, oh youth, and Franklin said, so what? A betrayal was acknowledged when Emerson wrote a letter to Van Buren and warned that the seat and seal would become an instrument of perfidy. That was neither the first nor the last in this country, this body of earth. But I didn't forget about you, our love, as we moved on and away back across the ocean, back across the sea, back across the spirit world into the land of the dead. Back to Castile and Aragon, where you don't think of we anymore. You've neglected our pain, you've ignored our children, you've discarded our dead. Back to King Louis, because you're the same, you've tussled our hair and tore at our trust and pushed us away and sold us out. Back to King George, you've taken our things and won't give them back. You came and you took and you made promises that sing and gave us a tongue bitter in taste, parched and thirsty. Broad Europe, you remain over there. You've forgotten my mother, my father, and my brother and sister who mourn every day. But we can't forget about you. Your violent emissaries remain. I'm not mad, I'm not angry, I'm not hurt. I'm just deeply troubled at heart. Maybe I'm lying. Maybe these words that follow are a way, not the only way, not the right way, not a good way, but an empty way, voided by language, voided by absence, void of trust. A hollow way being filled by those traumas I never wanted to be taught. Still, this earthly trauma begins with you. There you are, and hello, here I am, with this. There was a way for me to begin this book of poems called Perfidia. It really was a way to try to encapsulate the relationships I was thinking about through this body of work that I'd amassed. Was trying to work through, was kind of meandering and wandering through. This is an installation shot from the Hessel at Bard. It includes some text work, these calligrams that you see on the wall, which I'll talk about later. This video work, that's a still of a film called Dislocation Blues, which I made during my time at Standing Rock in 2016. And a series of photographs and multi-channel work. Now I have a bit of a wandering practice, a meandering practice. I began being bad at a lot of things, whether it was playing music or writing poems, taking photographs, recording music. I wandered a lot through my teens and through my 20s, and it wasn't until I was in, probably 27, 28, when I first picked up a camera and really found a way that's combined all these different things I've been thinking about and thinking through, whether that's storytelling, music, and time, the sounds and the emotional register that is accompanied through each of these different mediums. And it was picking up a camera and looking through the viewfinder and documenting my friends and I building a fishing scaffold, incorporating the techniques that I learned editing sound and music from my bands, when I was a teenager in my early 20s. We weren't very good, so please don't ask, But it was one of those things, it was just like there's an accumulation of experiences, an accumulation of testing and thinking through different modes and mediums that really give me the foundation to approach documentary and nonfiction work. Now, I'd say that I began as a documentarian. That's how I first started making films. That's how I first started thinking about them critically. And through diving into the history of ethnographic cinema and the problems within that, and this idea of who traditionally has held the camera and who traditionally has pointed the camera at whom, there became, a really exciting way to think through those histories and those traditions and to think about where I fit into that. Now, as I began working through documentary and through experimental film and ethnographic film and experimental ethnographic film and questioning where do I fit into the ethnopoetic relationship to all of these different things, I also began to reject some of those frameworks that I felt I had to respond to. I was interested in ethnopoetic cinema, and I'll talk a little bit about that later. But I was tired of the ethno suffix attached to that. that the things that I had to do had to be in response to these Western traditions, these Western ideas of looking at the world. And ethnographic cinema, for what it's worth, is a relatively young field and a young way of thinking about documentation and documentary. Now, this is a series of photographs that I did called The Land Describes Itself. I think it was a transition point for me from looking at the ethnographic experimental realm that I was in towards back to like 2D works, the photographs, which I really got my start in, I think. When did I get a start? I took like a semester of black and white photography when I was 18 at a local community college and dropped out halfway through. So I never learned how to process the film, but I learned how to think about composition. But it was through the work that I returned to photography as a way to, one, re-engage with my relationship to a camera and to just think about taking photos differently. Not with the phone, not with the point-and-shoot camera or DSLR, but like a 35 millimeter camera, which I never really, I hadn't really worked with that in about 12 years at that point, or 13 years. So with this series, it's called The Land Describes Itself, and it began in a somewhat convoluted way. So these are about 13 by 13 inches, and they're dive bond mounted, so they're kind of floating in the frame without glass. They're unglazed with these frames. And so what I did was I had like 4 or 5 rolls of 35 millimeter film that I had taken and had them digitized and scanned. And then I don't know what came first, but I was thinking a lot about overhead projectors. I mean, these are like the old school ones, just like the flatbed in the front of a teacher's room in elementary school, and just you put transparencies on top of it and it projects on the wall. And so, I don't know, there's something about that I was feeling a bit nostalgic for. Just kind of going back to like DOL, daily oral language is what they called it when I was in grade school. And I found one on eBay, and then I decided to print out these photographs on transparency paper. And so I had them in my studio, and I was just like messing around with them, and I decided to start cutting them up and organizing them in different configurations. And from that, I just wanted to take photos of them. So I took photographs with my digital camera of these the displays that I was making. And then I printed them out on photo paper, and then I don't know why I wanted to do this, but I picked up a screwdriver and started etching text onto the photographs themselves. And so you can see on the bottom here, this one is called These Are Dense Countries and Empty Cities. And that was really the beginning of this series of work. I think there's about 20 of them total of this series that, I don't know, like all these different things clicked, moving through this very convoluted process, just the act of the 35, the printing out on transparency, the overhead, the photograph, the etching, and how that all relates to landscape, and how all that relates to this idea of describing the landscape. Now, there was a poem that a friend of mine wrote called So What? It's actually got a collection of poems, and every poem is called So What? And I love that about it, especially in his approach to, one, everyday life as a Native person, but then also questioning the relationship to the poetics, to the landscape, and to the work that he does. And in this one particular poem, the last few lines go, "Why write poems about the land? It describes itself." And he's talking about this colonial way of looking at the landscape and the history of landscape art or landscape photography or whatever it might be, and just this idea, that goes back 100 years or 200 years or hundreds and hundreds of years, I suppose, of painting the landscape, romanticizing the landscape, with sometimes the idea that it's you want to capture it before it's gone, before manifest destiny and westward expansion destroys it. That was like the modus operandi of some of these landscape painters in the 1700s and 1800s. And they weren't wrong, like western expansion really affected the landscape. But then how do we look at the landscape now, today, through these different orientations? Even you hold your phone sideways into a landscape mode, and it's just you think about this idea of the panorama and the things that you want to see and contain. And so there's something that I really enjoyed about just like the simple fact that this flatbed overhead projector was, this 1-to-1 ratio, a square, and what that means for these landscape photos that I had taken and am orienting them in different ways. And how can that communicate and how can that be part of a conversation between the landscape, where it isn't me trying to assign meaning to these different places based on the photograph that I take and this idea or this fallacy of a flat documentation or veracity through photography or through taking pictures or the ways that we try to capture them. And this was called This Is Where We Left Off. But rather, like, how can I construct these landscapes myself and in some ways obfuscate them and in some ways protect them and in some ways resist this sort of idea of colonization through documentation? And this one is called, this is a mnemonic for Truman Lowe. Truman is a Ho-Chunk artist who passed away 4 years ago, 5 years ago. He's a very influential artist to me, you know, growing up. There's like maybe one or two Ho-Chunk artists that I was aware of, and one of them was Truman. And he was a really kind human being and made really beautiful sculptures. And he made a series of works called mnemonics, which were references to Ho-Chunk mythology and Ho-Chunk belief and Ho-Chunk practices, but just like really delicate, beautiful pieces. And I just wanted to make this for him as after he passed away, just because I was thinking about him. And in some ways, that's another sort of description of the landscape, or a way that a landscape can interact with not only the histories that are present, but the gestures that we make to beckon those histories, to call those histories. This one is called, this is the By and By. These photos were taken on a canoe journey that I did with the Confederated Tribes of Grand Rounds up in the Puget Sound of Washington. This is a certain body. So there's about 15 or 16 or 20, I forget how many of these. And that body of work became the land describe itself. And through that, I was also, like I said, you know, kind of like bounce around between these different ideas. And after the opening of that exhibition at this gallery in Milwaukee, I was with a friend of mine, and we were talking about the films that we wanted to make. And he told me his film, and I told him the film that I was thinking about, which was something like an homage to Hollis Frampton's film, Nostalgia. Because I've been thinking a lot about nostalgia, and I've been thinking a lot about these photographs and like where I was when I had taken them and just the sort of memories that were contained in them. And like I said, I was interested in getting away from the ethnopoetic or just the ethnographic commentary, which I felt compelled to participate in. And I wanted to explore more this idea of myths and mythology, like on my own terms, without necessarily the prescribed ideas of having to respond to Western or anthropological thoughts when it came to these things. And so using these photographs as a foundation and using some of the formal strategies of Hollis Frampton in his film Nostalgia, I'll quickly describe it. It was made in 1971, I believe, and it's just a camera looking down on a hot plate, and there's a photograph on it, and the photograph slowly burns away and burns into nothing. And you hear a voiceover describing a photograph, but it's not the one that you see. Now, as soon as the photograph burns away, it cuts to the same hot plate, but with a new photograph. And it was the photograph of what the person was describing in the last scene. And so they begin describing a new photograph that you don't see, and like that's the structure of the film for about 45 minutes. It sounds boring, but it's exhilarating, I swear to God. And there's just something about that relationship to these stories and how they're told that I was really drawn to when it came to one thinking about mythology and the ways that they can, or myths have been separated from the myth makers and the myth keepers and those that tell the myths and those that create the myths and those that hear the myths. You know, just there's this problem that happens when it comes to Native cultures, this idea of authenticity, or who is the authentic Indian? Is it the informants, as they're called, that told stories, sacred stories, to a white anthropologist in 1910? And once they were documented and written down, is that how they exist from now on? Is that how we're supposed to engage with them? But these myths change over time. They change over season. They change from night to night or from storyteller to storyteller. They're living things that are meant to be adapted to the audience and changed by the audience over time, over generations. And a problem with them being written down, well, I mean, you know, there's pros and cons. You know, we have some of them now because they were written down and tribes were wiped out. But also it separates us from the myths that we have created and the myths that are part of our cultures and our communities. And I don't know, just like all those things I'm thinking about and thinking through, especially with this work and just wanting in some ways to create my own myth or create another mythology that exists outside of that canon. Rather, how can I relate to a nostalgic recollection or anticipate nostalgia with a group of friends, and from that, transform that into a myth? You know, what is the function of nostalgia? Because I don't like to critique that nostalgia is just, you know, something that someone is feeling sad about or missing or whatever, or call on work nostalgic or what have you as an easy critique for something. but rather like, what does nostalgia, how does that exist in service of something larger or something more meaningful or something with even like utilitarian value? So for me, feeling nostalgic about this moment in time and like writing this thing, it's the creation of a myth. It's the creation of lore. Like, how can I also imbue some lessons that I learned into this thing? Or maybe not. I don't even know what the lessons are, but rather how can the creation of this thing function as lore? And that's the title of this film that I made in 2019, incorporating some of the approaches that I used for these photographs. Now, I'll play you an excerpt from it. What I ended up doing with this is I incorporated the text that I wrote for Perfidia, which was part of what I had read in the beginning, as the voiceover for this. And I filmed myself on a 16mm camera, Bolex, adjusting and orienting these images. And I also filmed my friends and I, who were about to move apart from each other, performing this song that we would randomly try to cover by Bo Diddley. So this is short excerpts. This is lore. And then become the quiet one up the road, up the stream, off the path, near the clearing by the river, where we burned the kindling and talked and told stories about water and the waves, with swells calling to us on nights like this, and stars would flicker and fade as eyelids lift slowly under lashes way down, dressed by drops of dew, drawn in the morning fog, in the fog, in the misty fog, yet to burn away. 1, 2, 1, 2, 3, 4. This is Eros and Caprice, spanning and describing valleys cut deep by rivers, pushing down on the rise of earth. Their games were played, and now what we have is a land and a space, open and full of vacant stories, slack-jawed and staring, waiting for what will come next. While waiting, they sing a song heard once on a radio in a shop during lunch in the winter, with a love unconfined and unrestrained, and over as soon as it began. The rhythms and shape never change, and EJ's voice strains against the repetition. This is the old way. So this is a short excerpt from Lore. It's about a 12 or 13-minute film. It was 10 minutes, but around that time. And yeah, it was a way to work through these different things that I've been making, like the titles of the photographs, like this is Eros Caprice, this is the By and By. Those I ended up incorporating into Perfidia, the text itself, and reading for this film. And so the three of these different bodies of work, or the three of these different objects or things, the photographs, the poem, the film, I mean, they all for me exist in a constellation of sorts. And I like the word constellation, partly due to this right here, because it points to just a configuration of things that exist somewhat independently of one another, but also together. I mean, another way to think about it is like a glissance archipelago, this idea of these different things that exist, but not exclusively independent of one another. Now, I also began making these text wall pieces. This is a vinyl. I think this is about 10 feet by 8 feet or something like that. And this is an install from the Hessel. Now, with the calligrams, it also relates to this idea of a lost sort of, or denied indigenous history. Now, where I'm from in Wisconsin, where my tribe is from in Wisconsin, they have large effigy mounds, probably as large as this room, about that tall, that are in the shape of different beings and creatures, and their relationship to our culture is very palpable and very important to us. But as they were, I don't want to say excavated, as they were torn up, dug up by farmers and amateur archaeologists in the late 1800s in Wisconsin, they would dig up our things and they would destroy them and create I don't know, these ideas about who built them. And one of their ideas that has persisted throughout the last 100 and some odd years is that there were the mound builders were part of some great civilization that is not there anymore. And the Ho-Chunk people in these lands are just squatters, that we didn't build them. I mean, even though we have stories, even though they're part of our culture, even though they're part of our collective memory, it was denied to us. And part of that has to do with lands and the ownership of lands and the way that that is politicized, which also relates to NAGPRA, the Native American Grace Protection and Repatriation Act. So there's all these different things that go along with how mounds, the ones that have survived the destruction of farms and highways and houses and settlements and whatnot, how those are related to us. And it's a somewhat simple gesture. There's these type of poems called calligrams by this poet, Guillaume Apollinaire, who practiced in the beginning of the 20th century. I think he died during World War I. But there was something about this form of poems and poetry, which wasn't quite concrete poems, but just something else that I was really drawn to. And so I appropriated these texts and put them in forms and these shapes of the effigy mounds. You know, just this sort of like play on appropriation and also reconfiguration. Now the text that is here, this one is titled "Situated at the east end of Devil's Lake on Section 25 THN R6B on N. Kirk's Pleasure Ground." It's a bit of a long title, but it's a title of a map, of a survey map, where there used to be a bird effigy, a thunderbird effigy, but it's not there anymore. But the text here, it reads, "There are vast areas of human life to which scientific methodology is inept, to which ethnographic description must give way to the ethnopoetic, a series of concrete and luminous images, arranged by intuition rather than prescription, and whose shifting configurations, like the points of and between the constellations, map out a piece of the world." Elliot Weinberger. Now he wrote this essay called "The Camera People" in I think 91 or 92, and in it he writes about the history of ethnographic film and arrives at the conclusion that it's a very young medium, and what he supposes or proposes is this idea of the ethnopoetic, which is what happens when people who traditionally have had cameras pick them up and start pointing them at the things that they want to. And so it's a thread, like I mentioned earlier, that kind of weaves through my practice and weaves through my thought process, is how to, in some ways, detach myself from the expectations that are thrust upon me by a largely white American world, whether that's how I look, how I live, where I live, what I do, how I talk, all these different things, you know? It's just these things that pull at you and pull at your idea and way of being. And so there's something about these calligrams, or just like even through this relationship to text, or this relationship to the ethnopoetic, that reoccurs and occurs throughout my work and thinking. I'll show you an excerpt from a film from 2016 called "I'll Remember You as You Were, Not as What You'll Become." This is an elegy to Diane Burns, and it was one of the first sort of ways that I thought about using calligrams in this work as it related to our belief systems. But I will play it. So that was I'll Remember You As You Were, Not As What You'll Become, which in essence is an elegy to this native poet, Diane Burns, who passed away in 2007, I believe. She was a great poet. I mean, I wish she had a chance to write more or more of her work was available. But she has this one line that I think I knew the line before I knew her work, and the line was, "This ain't no stoic look, this is my face." And there's something about that that definitely resonated, for someone who grew up being told to smile more, And with this film, it's based around a performance which I didn't include in this excerpt, but the guiding framework for it for me is this relationship to my tribe's belief in reincarnation and how we approached it. And also the text that you saw at the beginning in the calligram was from the ethnographer Paul Radin, who wrote 4 or 5 books about my tribe, detailing our practices, our life, our beliefs, our ceremonies, by things that he probably shouldn't have written about, or that's I know there's a lot of people now in my community who, wish that he didn't. And so when I was reading this book, it's called The Road of Life and Death, I didn't want to finish the book. I don't think I made it past the introduction because I felt like these are things that I don't want to learn this way, and these are things that shouldn't come to me in this way. But rather I focused on this one sentence that was describing our approach to why, Why do we want to engage or practice reincarnation? And it was through that line that first calligram appeared, and then this procession started. And part of the strategy around that too, it's like, for those of you that recognize, it's a powwow. It's a Native American powwow, and that's grand entry, where people are dancing. But there was something about the images that when I was filming them and then when I was editing this piece together where I felt protective. I didn't want to share them. These are my friends. These are people that I know, that I lived in Portland with for a while. And rather, so that inspired the sort of a effect of trying to abstract the images and abstract the people in them. And from there, I also wanted to disassociate the relationship of the powwow and the spectacle of the powwow by removing the powwow music. Because oftentimes when people who aren't familiar with our cultures, they see a powwow or see something that is representative or signifies us, they kind of stop there, like, oh yeah, I know what that is, I get it. Or they become overwhelmed by the options of trying to interpret what it means and how it all exists. And so with these gestures, I wanted to remove I wanted to focus and attention to the outfits, to the dancing, just have that be part of this procession that is relating to this procession of life and death. And the music itself is from the Sacred Harp Songbook, which I'm not sure if some of you are familiar with, but it's like a shape note singing. It's just a singing practice, church practice that began in the South in, I think, the early 1900s. And I think it's beautiful. It's complicated. And just how do these things pair together? And what are the ways of looking at the juxtaposition or the montage of the dancing and this Christian music, this choral music, and also what is a powwow in and of itself? It's a neocultural phenomenon that has a lot of complicated relationships to ceremony, to native ceremony. But it isn't necessarily tied to ceremony in ways that people can ascribe to it, And so it's just it's about all these sort of ideas, and it's about the sort of deterritorialization that comes with these practices and the neocultural constructions of existing as a Native person for the last 120 years in this country. What ways do we gather, and what ways do we mourn, and what ways do we celebrate? And it's often all in the same position or all in the same place. Now, this is another calligram that relates to, these belief systems. This is, I guess, more of an intaglio, which my tribe also had built, but there aren't any that survive. We're just instead of mounds of earth, it's just dug up in the shape of effigies. But the text for this one is, the title of it, this is Morning Star carrying the head of Evening Star. 2 figures from our stories. The swiftness of his motion is not only the usual attribute of Morning Star, but in this case it is meant to describe the rapidity of the mere 8-day inferior conjunction. In the superior conjunction, the Morning Star disappears and 50 days transpire before the Evening Star appears in the inferior conjunction. Only 8 days pass before the twin of Evening Star appears in the sky. So the two are together in the lodge of the sun for only a brief period and then pass from it. It's like the way that, knowledge is contained in our stories and the way that it understands the world, and it felt important to have that recognized in this text, no matter how abstracted it is. Part of it is like I want you to work for it too, it's hard to read, and it just asks for time. Or whatever time you're willing to give. Maybe you just want to look at it for a few seconds and walk on, That's cool too. And here's another install image of the calligram at the Hessel. And there you see another series of photographs and a multi-channel work, which I'll talk about. This is another calligram that is in the shape of a serpent. And this is the one that I use a letter from Ralph Waldo Emerson that he wrote to Martin Van Buren, the president in the mid-1800s, begging him to not go through with the Cherokee removal, which led to the Trail of Tears. The text that I pull from the letter is, "For how could we call the conspiracy that should crush these poor Indians our governments, or the land that was cursed by their parting and dying imprecations our country, anymore? You, sir, will bring down that renowned chair in which you sit into infamy, if your seal is set to this instrument of perfidy. In the name of this nation, hitherto the sweet omen of religion and liberty will stink to the world." I don't know if it came true or not, I don't know. Here's another install shot of I think this is an Arl. There's a close-up of the text from the Morning Star. Now, as I began to think through these works with the photographs, the videos, the calligrams, I began to explore more of the multi-channel process of my practice. Not so much thinking about getting out of the cinema space, but thinking about different ways that the work can exist in places other than a cinema. And for me, that was being intentional with the multi-channel work, having 2 video screens, 3 video screens, 4 video screens at a time in a space on loop with a stereo sound mix from each of the different screens, and how does that play with attention, and how does that draw someone's attention into the things that I'm working through and trying to, explore, or discover, or what other problematic words can I think of? But with something like this video here, that you see in the background, or sort of, is this one called Cloudless Blue Egress of Summer, which is not that one, it's this one. So this is the first 2-channel video that I did. It was based on a commission for a residency at Crisp Ellert's Art Museum at Flagler College in St. Augustine, Florida. And I'd never been to St. Augustine or Florida before this, but there was something about the, the invitation that I just, found really welcoming. And I did not know this before, but there is a fort in St. Augustine called Fort Marion. And before that, it was called Castillo de San Marcos. It was built by the Spanish in the 1600s, and since its inception has been on the wrong side of history, maybe to this day. I don't know, the Park Services owns it, and they're all right. But during its time as a fort by the U.S. government in the 1800s, it was a prison. It was a prison during the Seminole Wars in the 1830s, and it was a prison during the end of the Indian Wars in the 1890s. They would house prisoners of war at this fort, Fort Marion. And it is where Lieutenant Richard Pratt basically began the boarding school system in the United States. He's the person that had said it's let's kill the Indian and save the man, which haunts. It's a haunting statement because of how successful it was in some ways, but also in the ways that it wasn't. And there's something about that really, I'm working through. Like my great-grandma went to a boarding school down in Riverside called Sherman, and just the effects of that linger in my family. So did my grandma on my dad's side, but it was a different experience. Now, there's something about going to this fort and being in this place, this 400-year-old fort, and trying to make work around it. And the thing that I ended up finding was, an exploration of space, but also this idea of stories, this idea of presence and the demarcations of presence that exist or have survived. Now, on the left screen is a scrolling text in these different shapes of Kawakache's escape from Fort Marion. I think he was the only person to have escaped from that. And this is a long account of how he did that. It contained fasting and trying to slide through these narrow bars. And on the right screen are these drawings. I'm not sure if you're familiar with ledger arts, but it's a style of artwork that was made by native peoples in the late 1800s, early 1900s, that just have ledger paper and you have them drawing scenes of war, of horses and headdresses and that kind of stuff on them. And it's very, very popular, and there's large collections of it out there in the world. But when I was in St. Augustine, I went to the St. Augustine Historical Society, and they had a banker's box of drawings, of ledger drawings, that were never sold, because part of the project of Fort Marion under Richard Pratt was to have these prisoners of war make these drawings so that they could sell them to tourists and then fund the boarding school system. And this is all the typical stereotypical headdresses, war bonnets, horses, spears, bows and arrows, etc. But you can see in the image there, one of them is of a horse from a carnival or a circus. And so on this screen, I'm just have the camera pointed down. I'm just moving through these drawings one by one. There's about 20 or 30 of them, and just spending a little bit of time with these drawings underneath the camera. And they're really beautiful. The scraps, the fragments, these sort of failures. Just these thinking about these prisoners, drawing these horses and performers at a circus, 120 years ago. And there's something devastating about that. It's also something beautiful. And part of the project of this wasn't necessarily to. Well, first I should say, too, I never wanted to make a boarding school film because I felt like there's other work being done that's important when it comes to that conversation, and I didn't know what I could contribute. But the thing that I was drawn to with this is how to also, again, rehumanize our ancestors, rehumanize these prisoners. And I think that's a thread throughout the work that I do, is just this relationship to the past and also how to relate to the future in terms of who will come after we're gone. And in some ways collapsing those timelines and collapsing those, false sort of differences of the past and the present. But yeah, it's about a 12, 13-minute film on loop. And it's just, some of the things that I think about while working through this stuff. This is from Miami. This is a 3-channel piece called In Dreams in Autumn with these diptych sort of photographs that I've been making, where I'm continuing the process or practice of etching on them. This is another install shot of In Dreams in Autumn. I think this is in Arles. Now, this film is based around some text that I wrote also. It came after Perfidia, but this is some of the text. We're the children of a great love and a great violence. We're the grandchildren of a great love and a great violence. Our softness and our hardness are always at odds with those surfaces. We ask them to be kind and to be gentle. We tell ourselves to be kind and to be gentle. Our hands shake in the early evenings. They always shake in the early evenings, as the nights get long and we can't see when they'll end. An infinite morning haunts our dreams because of its quietude, because of its light and its air. A cold air that bites when it's frigid, deep down through our nose and into our mouth, and lower into our chest. An air that is cloudy and an air that is green, the green of the cedars in the mountains. Go camping again, my sister. Go back into the woods where you feel safe. I'll come find you when you find morning. I search for it myself and dream of an afternoon that we found in our youth. I picked you up and held you high and carried you around as you squeezed on my neck and called me big brother. You danced in the powwow, you danced in circles, you told me to watch and to let you know you danced good. 22 or 23 December's gone and I remember you clearly. I remember you now and I love you still. You've got the road and I've got the road, and we'll meet in the Yakima prairies once we've walked through our stories and slowly ease away from our speed and our dread that hurry our hearts and exhaust our bones and our ancestors. They're not our ancestors, though. They're our mothers and our fathers sitting quietly alone as we watch them make sense of their youth. They're clouds to us now, just hues of light and recollections of feeling and emotion. We imagine the colors were their dreams, churning away in their memories, mnemonics of shape and reason on syncope and swaying, as the anxieties of the gods sit heavy in the past, and they say, such are things in dreams in autumn. Now, that was like, I don't know, it's indicative of the things I've been working on the last few years, where it is trying to reconcile family and presence and place, and this question of where do I exist and how do I exist in this world. This is from the Poor Farm in Wisconsin exhibition space. Now, for me, multi-channel does these things, especially with text, with scrolling text, with these different sort of formal strategies that I've been working through. This is a 3-channel version of fainting spells, installed at the Poor Farm. This is the single-channel version. And I'll play you an excerpt from it as well. And I think this relates directly to what I'm thinking about when it comes to the mythology or the myth-making or the creation of myth. Now, this film's about the creation of a myth for this plant that's my tribe used to revive people that had fainted, called the Hopinka. It's also known as the Indian pipe plant. I'll just play you an excerpt from the beginning. It's from a Fanning Spells in 2017 or 18, I believe. Yeah, the film is very much making up a myth. You know, it's something I'm not necessarily trying to enter into the official Ho-Chunk canon, but rather seeing a place or a space where there isn't a story, you know, and wondering where has it gone? Was there ever one? And how then do we start to reclaim that practice of myth-making, of the creation of these stories? And like, what does that mean? Why? What's important about it? And some of it is that idea of ownership of your own culture, this idea that you are authentic. You know, there's a lot of markers around authenticity when it comes to being Native in this country that are very complicated. And this is a small way of working through them. I don't have a good segue into these photographs, but I think that they all kind of circle these same ideas of the lands, of language, of place, and poetics. And how can I or we be a part of these sort of ways of looking at the world? And still, like, I'm looking at the world through like this square sort of frame. It's just the result of the camera that I was using, this medium format camera. And with this body of work, this series is called The Breathings. And the breathings are a form of Ho-Chunk prayer for direction. And they were taught to me by my dad, but I don't think he knew that. And so I made about 17 or 16 of these, or 15, somewhere around there. And in them, I continued the practice of inscribing text on these images. This time I used a Dremel tool instead of a screwdriver, but if you can see, like around the edge, I inscribed this text that I wrote. Now this is of Lake Michigan. Again, they're also die-bond mounted. But the text that I wrote for this is, "Ahahe," as my dad used to say. He learned it from my great-grandfather, I imagine. Blue sky with a good voice, across this water on the other side of the encircling lake. We're not far from there in the direction that it'd lead us. Ahahe. This one is, oh, being here right now, not thinking of yesterday or the day before, but a long time ago last night, Auntie mentioned today, and the rain falling and streaking against the upstairs window, as Stacy and I looked down on the birch waiting to be climbed. This isn't the outside, and being here then felt more comfortable, in slicks and hoods, and boots, and in our youth. This is a close-up image of some of the text inscribed. There's another one of the Dejan. The mountains at home. Oops. I'm traveling, actually. This is across one of the Great Lakes. Now, as I've been thinking through these different formal strategies, whether it is the square image or etching text on an image, you know, I just try to do things incrementally in a certain way. And so the next series I did, I think you saw a brief image of those diptychs, which are about 40 inches by 30 inches, or no, 60 inches by 30 inches. These ones I scaled up to like 40 by 40, and they do still have the text etched on them, but this body of work relates to, I guess, the next thing I've been thinking about or trying to work through, which has to do with NAGPRA, which I mentioned earlier, the Native American Graves Protection and Repatriation Act of 1990, 91? 90. Which, you know, basically, for those of you that don't know, it just was a law that was created that demanded that museums give us back our things, give us back our dead, give us back our ancestors. And it's had a spotty history the last 30 or so years, 31 years, 32 years of compliance. Some museums are more compliant than others. Some states are more egregious than others. The most egregious is Illinois, which I think has some 15,000 ancestral remains in its collections, in its vaults, in its universities, in its museums. And it's something, you know, this is a thing that, you know, you grew up hearing about as a Native person that kind of like exists in your head. You hear about NAGPRA, you know, what sort of things are being done to reclaim land, to reclaim funerary objects, to reclaim people. And it was through this project that I did with ProPublica. They published this piece on the Illinois State Museum system in January. And it was a look as to why Illinois is the worst. You know, and there's like so many things that relate to that. A lot of it comes down to just institutional racism and this idea that Why give these things back to tribes? They can't take care of them. Or another tool that a place like Illinois uses is this idea of the historical record. So if things weren't documented in a historical way, then how can you know, you know? But the thing that the furthest historical record that goes back in Illinois is the Jesuits, what's it called? The Jesuit Relations, which is the documentation that Jesuit priests, missionaries kept as they were traversing the Midwest and the East Coast. And those go back to the 1620s, the 1630s. But before that, there's nothing. And so they don't count our stories as documentation. They don't count our testimonies, or they don't count things that were said, 200 years ago. It's just this idea of we can't give them back to the wrong people, so we might as well keep them. So it's just there's things in that have to do with knowledge and have to do with authority and who has the authority to keep these things and to give them back and to take care of them. And you can see how all of this affects how we exist today and how we think of ourselves today, or even how broader Western America, white America thinks of us or doesn't think of us. Now, some of these photographs were taken in Illinois near the site of the Dixon Mounds and near Cahokia. Yeah, the one on the left is of this lake overlooking the Dixon Mound complex, which is where there was this museum built on the site of a mass grave that was excavated that was Cahokian. And so they built a museum on top of this exposed grave. And they finally closed it in 1990, I think, with the passing of NAGPRA, but it's still there. And it's pretty dark. But they have the first native director, the first Illinois native director in that museum ever. And he's doing a lot of work now to try to fix things and to make things right. Now, through that, I also made this, as I was working through it, I made this piece called Sunflower Siege Engine, which was an installation, a single-channel installation that I finished last fall. I'll show you a clip of that before we end. I think we'll end on that. But here's a few other photos from the same series, but in different contexts. This is another install shot, I think, from the Guangzhou Biennial of Sunflower Siege Engine. Now, I don't know what the film is. I think about that all the time. But I think about how I use work to try to think through these things that I don't know how to make sense of. That's why I make videos. That's why I write. That's why I incorporate these different elements that, I think a lot about, whether it's NAGPRA or myths or ethnopoetics or ethnography, and how I'm existing in all of these, and how I'm complicit in all of these, and how I'm holding a camera, but then also how much I love the moving image medium, and how much of a history is very much part of the present and how we exist today. Now, this excerpt from Sunflower Siege Engine is a bit of a strange spot. In it, there's three elements that I'm working with. One is this text that I wrote, which was actually a piece for this PS1 show for Diane Burns. I was asked to write something, so I wrote this poem. And it was wandering through, and with her videos about how do I exist in this space. And the other element is this archival footage of Richard Oakes on Alcatraz, reading the proclamation. And the third element is this karaoke sing-along music video of a song that a friend had written. And I don't know, all of these things together, they're doing something. And that something has to do with resistance, and also that has to do with this sort of recontextualization of the culture that we have and the culture that we're given, and also the culture that we make for ourselves on our own terms. So I will play this excerpt. It's about 2 or 3 minutes, I think. And yeah, we can go into questions after that. I cough when I smoke these days. I don't remember when I stopped being young, but the pain in my body and weariness in my hands make it clear. It was a long time ago last night. calling me down the street, saying, "Don't look at me anymore. Don't let them see me. I'm tired of my face and my voice and my hands." There's a failure in our walk, I think to myself as I think about body and face and form and place and the way my hands look when they type these words, when they clap real loud, when they squeeze yours real tight, when they hold these books, when they clutch that beer, when they shake late at night after tossing and turning for hours on end, trying to dream those dreams I had when I was small, when you were old and when I saw them in your words and heard your voice.
The so-called...
Just a minute, channel permit it.
Okay.
Yeah, roll, John.
We feel that the so-called Alcatraz Island is more than suitable for an Indian reservation, as determined by the white man's own standards. By this we mean that this place resembles most Indian reservations in that, 1, it is isolated from modern facilities and without adequate means of transportation. 2, it has no fresh running water. 3, it has inadequate sanitation facilities. 4, there are no oil or mineral rights. 5, there's no industry, and so unemployment is very great. 6, there are no health care facilities. 7, the soil is rocky and unproductive, and the land does not support game. 8, there are no educational facilities. 9, the population has always exceeded the land base. 10, the population has always been held as prisoners and kept dependent upon others. Further,
Cut it, Norm.
that's right, I'm just one of that.
was an excerpt from Sunflower Siege Engine, which is about 20, or no, it's about 13 or 14 minutes long. But it's all that I have for you right now. Thank you. And if you have any questions, I think they've got a microphone. But yeah, happy to talk about anything.
Thank you. First of all, thank you so much for your amazing presentation. It's just really cool to have you here, like seeing your work live in front of me. But I'm aware that you received the MacArthur Fellow Genius Award of like $800,000 a year ago, which is amazing. Congratulations. So beyond paying off your student debts, how do you think that the financial liberty of this award has affected your work? I know that there's an emphasis on like the organic moment within your films, and has this money at all affected the original methodologies in creating your films? And does financial liberty dissociate the accessibility that your work has advocated for originally?
That's a good question, because it touches on so many different things that I'm grappling with right now, you know? I mean, I'm going to get the rest of my loans paid off next year, and that's going to be a different way of thinking about living in the world, you know? But then also, too, it's just like getting these teaching positions, you know, and like that offers some stability that I haven't had most of my life. And I think it relates to how I first started making films, which was, you know, being 27, 28, and it just like taking like 10 years to get through my undergraduate, which is like the reason why I have so much money that I'm paying off right now, you know? And the thing that always motivated me was having a camera, you know? It's just like, as long as I have a camera and a microphone and a laptop to edit on, then I can make something. And so that was freeing early on, where it's like I didn't need to apply for grants or funding or like getting rejected from XYZ lab or whatever. It was having that freedom of just like, no one can tell me not to make something, so then why can't I just make it myself? Which is like one of the reasons why I entered the more experimental film world, was because that was aligned with the things that I was interested in. Like when I first went to grad school in Milwaukee in 2013, I got into the program, but when I got there, I found out it was an experimental film program. But I had no idea what experimental film was. You know, I didn't go to film school. You know, I was just like, I loved movies and I liked working with the camera, and I just liked, you know, figuring out how to do this stuff on my own through watching YouTube and reading blogs. And so like that foundation of just, you know, being very self-sustained and at the same time entering these different spaces where there was some kinship or alignment when it came to like the structure of these films or the possibilities of them, that just like became liberating in its own way. In the same way that not having any money is constraining, I think having an abundance of support can be constraining in a different way, especially when it comes to expectations or where that money comes from. You know, like I don't have funders looking over my shoulder saying, where's your deliverable? Or let me look at these cuts. So that sort of freedom is something that I really fostered throughout my career. And it's something that's, you know, as these different sort of levels of success have happened over the last 10 years, it's something that I'm constantly trying to evaluate when it comes to what do I do now with this, but then more importantly, what can I do for others in the same or who are in the same position that I was? Which is why, like in 2019, 18, some friends and I started this collective called Cousin Collective, which was designed to support Indigenous experimental filmmakers, because there is no support for Indigenous experimental filmmakers in the United States, let alone Canada. I mean, there isn't any support for experimental film in the United States, so it's just, there was such a, I don't know, this idea of how also the four of us found each other, which was, like, there's a story I tell often, but my friend Adam Khalil, like, for years, everyone would be like, oh, have you met Adam? Have you met Sky? Because like we were the only two Indians that were making experimental film, you know? And so we didn't want to feel like that. We didn't want to be tokenized, and we want to feel alone in this space, and to try to have to feel like we have to compete to be the Indians, you know, or whatever that means. Because sometimes that form of lateral oppression is real. And so rather, it's just like, how then can we, I don't know, help scaffold this up where, you know, it's just like, where is some support? Where is like $5,000 to help you pay your bills, or to like pay some rent for a few months so you can make your work? Or you want to buy a camera, or like, you know, buy a few months of Creative Cloud. You know, it's just like that sort of like giving it back, creating some sort of infrastructure that hopefully can be built upon, by those who are coming next is really important. Because like for me in the work, like, I mean, I have like my practice down, I feel like pretty comfortable in that, and a big part of that is just like maintaining connections with these things that I'm interested in that speak to me. And so right now it's NAGPRA, but it's just like a continuation of like going from mythology, neo-mythology, to issues of landscape, and also where it began for me, which was language revitalization. I mean, I kind of realized like I didn't mention language revitalization at all today, but it's such a huge part of like who I am in my practice. But it's just like, my focus right now is on NAGPRA. And so that doesn't mean that's not a part of it, but how can I also pull these threads that were important to me in that beginning into what I'm doing right now? And I think that, that's like kind of how I want to answer your question, where it's not like I'm just like, taking off in a private jet, but rather it's just, this is a continuation of this practice that I fostered that helped me survive and has been important to me over the years. And it's just like maintaining the integrity of that, is really important to me. I mean, it's just like I don't want to feel like I'm ever in a position of having to concede the things that I want to do or that I want to make to anyone, other than the people that matter, like my family, my community. And like those are the conversations I want to be having, And I don't know what the expectations are for my practice moving forward, but I know what I want to do and the things that feel relevant, because I also don't want to keep on doing the same thing over and over again. So in some ways, this financial sort of windfall, this support, allows me to do that in certain ways. But I don't know, man. I mean, like, I would consistently, all through grad school, have my camera in pawn, And it's just, when I would get out of pawn, it would be like when it would be time to film. And I don't have to do that anymore. But still, I have that sort of like seasonal way of thinking about work. Like, okay, I haven't really filmed for 4 or 5 months. Now it feels time to film. And it's just like how then my practice has been formed by these things and shaped by these things, and how can I also like maintain the integrity of that when it comes to trusting the things that I know how to do and not feeling inadequate in the ways that I have felt inadequate in the past. It's a very long way to answer your question. I'm sorry, I hope I did. Does anyone have any other questions?
I was curious about how you incorporate music in your videos. Since you said at the beginning that you weren't a very good musician when you were in a teenage band, but
Who is?
do you perform most of the music in the videos, or what kind of instrumentation?
Some pieces I do, some pieces I don't. But how do I incorporate music? I mean, somewhat obnoxiously, maybe. I don't know. I think that I found my way into editing through Pro Tools and GarageBand or whatever. Actually, it was Pro Tools, where it's just like I'd be in my room and just like layering all these different tracks with the guitar, keyboard, bass, synth, whatever it is, and then just trying to figure out how they all fit together and how to like create some sort of movements between these things that I would make somewhat disparately. And like that really informed how I edit. And so I constantly return to music. Even if like I'm looking through footage, I'll put music underneath it just to have something to give it a sense of a tone or a mood that I'm interested in. And sometimes like they stick, but like with the song in this one, usually when I include like a full song like that, it's because I'm listening to it obsessively, and like my friend Courtney sent me that song and I just loved it, I just would listen to it. I think one time I drove from New York City down to Baltimore, which is like a 3 or 4 hour drive, and I listened to it the entire time on loop, and it was just like, it does something for me. And there was something about, I think, the ways that, it's like a love song, but it's also how can that be applied to looking at the sort of loss or this relationship we have to these things or these beings or these ideas that are important to us. And so for me, it's like, the music is a way to reframe a relationship, an emotional relationship to something or someone other than the one that is expected, especially through the ways that trauma permeates our experience. The way that joy is also a possibility when it comes to thinking about the past and the things that were lost, and the ways that, I don't know, it's also like an invitation to do so as well. So I don't know, those things guide my choices, but usually the first one is somewhat instinctual or just an idea of like, I want this here, and so how then can I build this around this or speak to that intuitive motivation that's, inspired me in the first place. It's just like having the intuitive gesture, but then stepping back and saying, well, why is it intuitive? what in my life has brought me to this choice, and how did that shape how I'm approaching this? Because, intuition is nothing but an accumulation of experiences and the knowledge that you have and you've gained along the way. But yeah, sometimes you just want to sing along a song and karaoke at the end.
So I really enjoying the way you organize your thoughts about the history, the past and the current into that creative way. I'm really curious about what keeps you digging into the tradition of your tribe, and also, do you feel comfortable to express this on the public, and how do you balance this? Thank you.
Thank you. I think about that in terms of, I guess in the same vein as the comment around intuition, It's not so much digging into the traditions of my tribe, but beginning in a space where, how was I raised, by a Ho-Chunk dad and a Pechanga mom, and a Pechanga grandma, and Lummi cousins, all these different sort of belief systems and ways of being in the world, how did that inform who I am? And, just it's so much a part of my life. Or even just thinking back about being a kid and, I don't know, in some ways wishing I had this or wishing I had that. But looking back in retrospect, just being grateful for the things that I did have or the things that were given to me by my family, even though we didn't have a lot. And at the same time, it's just how then does that also reflective of Native culture and how it survives today, And how can... I think a motivation is also to not look at Native culture, Indigenous culture, or Ho-Chunk culture in an essentialized sort of way. It needs to check all these different boxes for it to be Ho-Chunk or Native, It's there's over 500 federally recognized tribes in this country, and there's over 500 ways of looking at culture and looking at history and looking at language and belief and the afterlife, et cetera. And I think there's something for me about looking at these questions I have about, where I come from, why we do things a certain way, and focusing or hyper-focusing on very, very small things and very specific things. It's part of what I said before, too, about, just not being held accountable to any funders or, people that I'm lobbying for money for to make these films. Well, part of that is I can make the films that I want to make, because no one is asking me to make a meditation on Ho-Chunk reincarnation, That's not part of any RFP at all. But so it's just well, then how can I just focus on that? And it's the idea of audience, too, isn't necessarily about exclusion or saying, I want to make something specifically Ho-Chunk or Pechanga or just Native in this country in general. Then that doesn't necessarily preclude people that are outside these cultures from not engaging with the work or viewing it or experiencing it. But the thing is what sort of cultural markers or references are in the work that they might not get? And I don't feel a responsibility to explain that. Just in the same way, we watch an American sitcom like Friends or something, do they stop every 20 minutes or five minutes or whatever and explain the context of this white American joke in New York City, It's this expectation that we should know these things as people outside of the mainstream or outside of the majority, whatever that is, to keep up, And so the slight inversion of saying, hey, I'm focusing on this, you guys keep up, that can be either an invitation for some or a door closing for others, or I don't know. But in a lot of ways, that isn't my responsibility, I feel the responsibility that I have is to maintain the integrity of what creative vision that I'm fostering and the things that I'm trying to say and work through in an ethical way that is responsible and responsive to my communities.
We have time only for one more question, so anyone? Okay. Oh.
Hi, thank you so much for that whole presentation. That was amazing. You talked a little bit about this idea of Western anthropological written history as having this inherent value in the eyes of obviously Western society. And I wanted to know what your relationship is to visual, like visual representations of history that you're kind of creating as opposed to written or oral histories. I guess in terms of maybe ranking of authenticity. Yeah, thank you.
I mean, well, I think about like where this work fits, and like I mean, the word that I use to describe it is like these are propositions, you know, like these are not answers. Like with the question of like where do these oral traditions or these stories exist in a time-based medium like a film, you know? Like I know I'm not trying to do like reenactments, you know, like sometimes those exist and sometimes they're helpful, sometimes they're not. But the things that I'm trying to do are just be so blatantly questions and experimental in the truest sense of the word, that they beget these conversations for others to participate in. You know, like, tell me I'm wrong. Tell me, like, you know, I don't like this, or I like this. Or maybe, like, in the best case, it inspires someone to do something else in response, in conversation with the work that I'm doing. And it's like, that's the thing that excites me about, you know, the work that is less prescriptive, or less like, this is how it is, this is how it has to be, is that it continues that conversational tradition of, like, oral storytelling, or just intergenerational storytelling, and how these things change and shift over time, the way that languages change and shift over time. Like, you know, the words that we're saying now weren't the words we were saying or using in the same way like 20, 30 years ago in English, you know? It's like the sign of a healthy language and a healthy culture is how things shift and change, because they're reflective of the people that are using them. And in that sort of vein, I feel like the work, in my most, you know, hopeful sense, is contributing to that. You know, like, I mean, with this idea like Cousin Collective also, it's just like how do we keep the conversation going and also make space and support for others to feel like they can enter this world and try to engage in these conversations and these practices. Because I mean, like, yeah, you know, I'm just some guy up here making a video with a camera, you know, and it's just like, it's the spirit of that, of just like, you know, not necessarily navel gazing, but just like wondering and daydreaming a bit, and thinking about how things existed before and how they exist today and how they have the potential to exist in the future. That, I don't know, I think is I don't know, I hope like welcoming and inviting, and in some ways, again, I guess like conversational to the larger spirit of how these histories exist. Because like even like with those historical documentations that I mentioned, or that, you know, you mentioned too, like, is how do I think about them? You know, in some ways it's a double-edged sword. Like there's no easy answer. You know, there's a lot of nuance to these things. And I like existing in the place of nuance, of how do I think about this book that was written by Paul Radin, and it's also something that, you know, gives me some hope, or just like is nice to revisit, or even seeing like historical photographs of family or relatives, you know, just thinking about the purpose of that, or the utility of that. So, I don't know, it's all messy, but in a good way. Thank you.